There is something hiding inside the blood of millions of people in Britain right now. Most of them have no idea it is there. It has been passed down, quietly, from parent to child for over 1,000 years, and it came from men and women who crossed the cold North Sea in open boats and never went home. Viking blood, Norse ancestry. And thanks to a wave of astonishing scientific studies over the last 10 years, we now know roughly how many Britons carry it, exactly where in the country it is hiding, and this is the part I really want to get to, how you can start to work out whether it is hiding in you. But I am going to be honest with you all the way through this, because there is a lot of nonsense talked about Viking DNA, and the real story is far more interesting than the myth. There is no single Viking gene. No test can hand you a certificate saying you are descended from a warrior. What the science actually found is stranger and better than that. So stay with me right to the end, because the second half of this is a practical guide. By the time we finish, you will know the surnames to look for, the place names that give it away, and what a DNA test can and cannot really tell you. And one of the clues is probably sitting in the name of the town your family comes from. Quick thing before we dig in. If you like this, real history, real science, no myths, all about who your people actually were, then subscribe to British Bloodlines. That is the whole reason this channel exists, and there is a lot more coming. It is free, and you will not miss the next one. Right, let us go and find the Vikings. First, the science. Because the claim that millions of Britons carry Viking blood is not a guess. It comes from some of the biggest genetic studies ever done. Start with the big one. In 2020, a team led out of the University of Copenhagen published the largest study of Viking DNA in history, in the journal Nature. They sequenced the genomes of over 400 human beings dug from Viking-age graves right across the Viking world: Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Greenland, the Baltic. 6 years of work. And what they found rewrote a lot of what we thought we knew. The first shock was this. Viking was never really one race. It was closer to a job, a way of life. The word itself comes from the Old Norse, and it meant something like a pirate, a sea raider. And when the scientists looked at who was actually buried in Viking graves, they found people who had no Scandinavian ancestry at all. In Orkney, off the north of Scotland, they found men buried with Viking swords, given full Viking funerals, who were genetically local, possibly among the first ancient Picts ever sequenced. Scottish and Irish people had been absorbed so completely into Viking society that they were buried as Vikings. So being a Viking was something you could become, not just something you were born. But the study also traced where the Vikings went by following their DNA, and the pattern is clear. The Danish Vikings came here, into England. The Norwegian Vikings went north and west, into Scotland's islands, into Ireland, out to Iceland. Different Viking peoples, different destinations. Hold on to that because it explains exactly where their blood is concentrated in Britain today. And how much of it is there. The lead scientist on that study put a number on it. Around 6% of people in the United Kingdom are predicted to carry Viking DNA. 6%. That is millions of people. Millions walking around today carrying a genetic signature from the age of the longship. But, and here's the first piece of honesty I promised you, that number comes with a catch, and it is a big one. Because the Vikings who settled here, the Danes especially, came from a part of the world that was genetically very similar to the Anglo-Saxons who had arrived a few centuries earlier. The Anglo-Saxons came from around Denmark and northern Germany. The Danish Vikings came from Denmark. Their DNA overlaps so heavily that telling them apart, in a modern person, is genuinely, maddeningly difficult. In fact, another huge study, the People of the British Isles Project, published in Nature in 2015, ran into exactly this wall. That study looked at over 2,000 British people whose families had stayed put in one place for generations. And in most of England, it could not find a clean, separate Danish Viking signal at all. Not because the Vikings were not here, but because their genetic fingerprint was almost identical to the Anglo-Saxon one already in the mix. The Viking blood is there. It is just wearing a very similar coat to its neighbors. So the honest scientific picture is this. Millions of Britons carry Norse ancestry. That is true. But there is no single clean Viking gene. And the amount any one person carries is hard to measure precisely and varies enormously depending on where in the country your family is from. Which brings us to the interesting part. Because in some corners of Britain that Viking blood is not faint at all. It is overwhelming. Look to the very top of the map. Orkney and Shetland, the islands off the north of Scotland. These were settled so heavily by Norwegian Vikings and ruled by Scandinavia for around 600 years that the genetics there are in a different league entirely. Studies have found Scandinavian ancestry of around 30% in Orkney and as high as 44% in Shetland, and tellingly, with roughly equal amounts coming down the male and the female line. That last detail matters. It means this was not just war bands of men, it was whole families. Men and women settling, farming, staying. Then come down the country and the Viking blood follows the history exactly. The far north of Scotland. The Western Isles and the Isle of Man, where Norwegian Vikings mixed with the local Gaelic people to create a whole new people, the Norse Gaels. Then the northwest of England, Cumbria, and the Wirral, and West Lancashire, settled around the year 900 by Norwegian Vikings pushed out of Dublin. There was a study of that exact area, led from the universities of Leicester and Nottingham, that recruited local men whose surnames went back centuries in the region, and found that among those old local names, the Scandinavian male line ancestry ran as high as 50%, 50% on the Wirral, right there tucked under modern England. And then the great swath of northern and eastern England that the Vikings themselves ran as their own territory, the Danelaw. Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, East Anglia, the East Midlands. This was Danish Viking country, governed by Danish law, with the great Viking city of York at its heart. And this is where we cross over from the science into your practical guide. Because the Vikings left something very specific written all over this part of the country. Something you can go and check yourself today. But before I show you how, do me that one small favor if you have not already. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. This is exactly what we do here, week after week, the real history and the real science of who you are. I would love to have you along for it. So, how do you find your Viking blood? Let us start with the two things you can check for free right now. Your name and your place. First, place names. This is the big one. When the Vikings settled, they named their farms and villages in their own language, Old Norse, and 1,000 years later those names are still on the road signs. If your family comes from a town whose name ends in certain ways, you are looking at a place a Viking very probably founded. The clearest one is the ending by B. Why? It is the Old Norse word for a farm or a village. Grimsby, Whitby, Derby, every one of them, a Viking settlement. Lincolnshire and Yorkshire are packed with them. Then there is thorpe, which meant a smaller, secondary settlement, and thwaite, which meant a clearing. You see that one all over Cumbria, and toft, a homestead. And listen for Norse words for the landscape too. A beck is a Norse stream. A dale is a Norse valley. A fell is a Norse hill. A ness is a headland. And gate in the old streets of a city like York, Coppergate, Kirkgate, comes from the Norse word for a street. If the place your family is rooted in is full of these, your ancestors were living in the thick of Viking country. Now be careful here, and I will always be straight with you. A Viking place name does not prove your personal family were Vikings. Sometimes English families lived in villages with Norse names. It is a clue. A strong, exciting clue, but a clue, not a verdict. Second free check, your surname. Some names carry Old Norse roots directly. Names beginning with kirk, from the Norse word for a church. Names built from Old Norse personal names. And the northern habit of son names, while not exclusively Viking, the pattern is denser in the Old Norse settled north. Again, a hint, not proof. But combined with a Viking region and a Viking place name, the hints start to stack up. And then there's the third root, the one everyone asks about. a DNA test. So let me tell you honestly what it can and cannot do. If you take one of the big autosomal tests, the household names, the spit in a tube kits, here is the truth. None of them can hand you a Viking score, no matter what the marketing implies. What they actually give you is a modern regional estimate. They will tell you that you have a percentage of Scandinavian ancestry, or Norwegian or Swedish and Danish. And because of that overlap problem I told you about, a big chunk of English people get a Scandinavian reading that could just as easily be Anglo-Saxon as Viking. The test cannot cleanly separate the two. So treat any Viking percentage with real caution. It is an estimate, with a wide margin, wrapped in clever marketing. There is a deeper route, though, if you really want to chase it. Testing your direct paternal line through the Y chromosome or your direct maternal line through mitochondrial DNA. These look at specific ancient lineages called haplogroups. And some haplogroups are strongly associated with Scandinavia. One called I1 is the classic Nordic paternal marker, and certain branches of another called R1a are linked specifically to Viking dispersal into Britain. If you carry one of those on your direct father's line, it is a genuine, meaningful hint of a Norse ancestor somewhere back there. But even here, honesty. A haplogroup that is common in Scandinavia is suggestive. It is not a stamp that says Viking. Plenty of men with these markers had nothing to do with Vikings. And the Y line and the maternal line each only capture one single thread out of your thousands of ancestors. No tests on Earth can point at your DNA and confirm a Viking stood in your family tree. What these tools can do is stack the clues: your region, your place names, your surname, your ancestry percentages, your haplogroup, until the picture becomes likely. Likely is the honest word. Not certain. Likely. And while we are being honest, let me kill a few myths on the way out, because you deserve the real Vikings, not the cartoon. They did not wear horned helmets. They never did. The only complete Viking helmet ever found is a plain rounded iron cap, no horns anywhere. The horns were invented in the 1800s, for the stage, for opera and romantic paintings, and they stuck. Every horned Viking helmet you have ever seen is a Victorian costume. They were not all tall, blonde, and blue-eyed either. The DNA showed Viking-age Scandinavians were genetically varied and often dark-haired. And here's the one I like most. Most Vikings were not warriors at all. The raiders and the fighters are the ones who made the sagas, but the people who actually carried this blood down to you were, overwhelmingly, farmers, ordinary people looking for land, crossing the sea to build a life. Remember Orkney and Shetland, equal male and female ancestry? Those were not warbands. Those were mums and dads and children, making a home on a cold island 1,000 years ago. So that is the truth of it. Millions of Britons carry Norse ancestry. It is concentrated in the islands of the north, the northwest, and the Old Danelaw of the east. You can hunt for it in your surname, in the Viking words hidden in your hometown, and in a DNA test, as long as you remember that what you are collecting is clues, not certainties. So now I want to hear yours. Where is your family from? Does your hometown end in by or thorpe or thwaite? Does a beck run through it, or does it sit in a dale, under a fell? Is your surname a northern son name, or does it start with Kirk? And if you have ever done a DNA test, did a slice of Scandinavia turn up that you could never explain? Put it all in the comments, the town, the name, the result, and let us work out together how likely it is that a Viking is hiding in your family tree. I read every single one. And I promise you, some of the townspeople drop in those comments are going to be pure Old Norse. And they will not even know it yet. Because the Vikings did not just raid this island and leave. A great many of them stayed. They married, they farmed, they had children, and their blood ran quietly down the centuries. Through 100 generations, all the way to someone alive today. Maybe someone in this comment section. Maybe you. And tracing that blood back to where it truly began is exactly what this channel is for. Stay close. We are only just getting started.